The morning air was heavy that December day in Wisconsin. A thin fog drifted over the lake, the kind that blurs the line between sky and water. Somewhere above that haze, a small plane carried a young man whose voice had once filled the world with light. He was 26, standing at the height of his gift, known across continents as the King of Soul. Crowds cheered his name, yet all he wanted was to make it to another show, to sing one more night for the people who believed in him. But what happens when a voice that could move millions meets a silence too deep to break? This is not a story about fame or conspiracy. It's a story about legacy and the way a man's music still echoes long after the world stopped hearing him. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before the world knew his name, there was a boy growing up in Macon, Georgia, a small southern town where the church was the heartbeat of every Sunday and music flowed through open windows like summer air. His name was Otis Redding Jr., and from the beginning, sound was his language. He was born in 1941, the son of a preacher and a housekeeper. His father, Otis Sr., worked at the nearby Air Force Base, doing whatever he could to keep food on the table. His mother, Fanny, was the quiet strength in the family, gentle but firm, the kind of woman who believed every child carried a purpose. When Otis sang in the Vineville Baptist Church choir, she'd stand in the back, smiling softly, knowing the boy's voice already carried more conviction than most grown men. Life in Macon wasn't easy. Segregation still shadowed every street. Opportunities for young black men were few, and dreams of music seemed distant. But for Otis, the world outside those small-town streets was already alive in his imagination. He would listen to Sam Cooke on the radio, or Little Richard, another son of Macon who had made it out, and he'd tell his friends, "That's gonna be me one day." As a teenager, he joined a local group called the Upsetters, later performing with the Pinetoppers, a rhythm and blues band that played at local clubs and fairs. His deep, soulful voice was different, rough yet tender, with a truth that couldn't be taught. People said when Otis sang, he didn't just hit the notes, he lived inside them. But like most stories of greatness, his journey didn't start with fame. It started with struggle. He dropped out of high school to help his family. He worked odd jobs, driving trucks, washing cars, anything that would keep the lights on. But the music never left him. Every free moment, he'd find his way back to the mic, chasing something invisible, that feeling he got when a crowd went silent, waiting for his next note. It was around this time that he met guitarist Johnny Jenkins, a local talent who often performed at Stax Records in Memphis. Otis started as his driver, just hoping to get close to the studio. One day, after a recording session, the producers gave him a chance to sing a few lines. That night, history changed. He recorded a ballad called "These Arms of Mine," a simple love song sung with a depth far beyond his years. When the record hit local radio stations, something about that voice stopped people in their tracks. It wasn't polished, but it was real, the kind of sound that felt like church and heartbreak all at once. Stax Records signed him soon after, and for the first time, the boy from Georgia had a chance to turn his dreams into something lasting. Still, fame didn't come easy. The early tours were brutal long drives, small clubs, and nights sleeping on buses. Sometimes the audience didn't show. Sometimes the pay never came, but Otis had something stronger than frustration: faith. He believed in his purpose. He believed that his music wasn't just entertainment, it was testimony. By the early 1960s, he had begun shaping the sound that would later define soul music. While others leaned into polish, Otis leaned into emotion. He wasn't afraid to let his voice crack or cry. To him, imperfection was honesty. He wanted listeners to feel what he felt: joy, pain, longing, redemption, all in one breath. At home, he remained grounded. He married Zelma Atwood, the woman who had stood by him before the spotlight. Together they built a quiet life between tours, raising children and dreaming of something bigger than success, stability, dignity, legacy. Those who knew him then said Otis was humble, sometimes shy, but always listening. He'd sit in smoky juke joints, studying how people moved when a song hit right. He believed music was a kind of language that could cross walls no one else could break. And even as the world began to open its doors to him, he never forgot where he came from. He gave money back to the church, supported local schools, and often told young singers in Macon, "Don't chase fame, chase feeling." Before the red carpets, before the fame, before that December flight, there was a boy from Georgia standing in front of a microphone for the first time, eyes closed, heart open. The sound that came out wasn't just a voice. It was the beginning of something timeless, a spirit that would one day remind the world what soul really meant. When Otis first stepped into Stax Records in Memphis, he wasn't there as a star, he was just the driver. The studio was small, filled with cigarette smoke and rhythm, but to him it felt like sacred ground. He watched through the glass as Booker T and the MGs laid down grooves that would shape an era. All he wanted was one chance to sing. That chance came late one night in 1962. Johnny Jenkins had finished his session early, and the producer asked if anyone else wanted to record. Otis raised his hand. The band was tired, but they played along. When he opened his mouth to sing "These Arms of Mine," everything changed. The room went still. The tape rolled, and for the first time, Stax had captured the raw, aching soul that would soon define its sound. The song was released quietly at first, just another single in a crowded market. But the emotion in his voice couldn't be ignored. DJs started spinning it across the South, then across the country. By the following year, it was a hit. Suddenly, Otis Redding, the boy from Macon, was no longer just a dreamer. He was a voice people couldn't forget. He began touring relentlessly, performing in small theaters, dance halls, and makeshift stages wherever they would have him. The conditions were rough. Segregation still dictated where his band could stay or eat, but every night on stage, those barriers disappeared. His shows were sweat and fire, no choreography, no polish, just a man giving everything he had. People who saw him live said his concerts were like spiritual revivals. He dropped to his knees mid-song, his shirt soaked through, eyes closed, pleading with the crowd to feel what he felt. In those moments, Otis wasn't performing, he was testifying. Behind the scenes, his reputation grew fast. Stax producers realized they had something rare, an artist who didn't follow trends but created them. He began writing his own material, songs like "Pain in My Heart" and "Mr. Pitiful," tracks that told stories of longing and dignity with the same honesty that marked his voice. By 1965, he was headlining major soul reviews alongside Sam and Dave and Wilson Pickett. But even among giants, Otis stood apart. While others chased glamour, he stayed grounded in truth. His lyrics were simple, but his delivery carried the weight of lived experience. Every baby and every "yeah" sounded like it came from somewhere deep. That same year, he recorded "Respect," a song he wrote for himself, but that later became an anthem for Aretha Franklin and the civil rights era. Few knew that behind the power of that single was a man who wrote it not out of pride, but out of love, a quiet demand for understanding, not fame. As his confidence grew, so did his influence. Otis began to shape the Stax sound, that unmistakable blend of gospel roots, Southern grit, and human vulnerability. He didn't just sing soul, he became its living definition. Musicians admired his discipline. He'd rehearse for hours, demanding precision from his band, yet always leading with kindness. By 1966, he was no longer just a voice from the South, he was America's soul. His songs started crossing the color line, reaching audiences who had never listened to black music before. On stage, he carried himself with quiet command. Off stage, he remained humble, often telling his wife Zelma, "I just want the music to last longer than me." He didn't know it then, but it already had. By the time 1967 arrived, Otis Redding had become more than a performer, he was a force. Every city he touched left a trail of sold-out shows, and every song carried the same unfiltered power that had once filled the small churches of Georgia. The boy who had driven others to the studio was now the man every musician wanted to record with. That year, he earned the title the King of Soul, not because of marketing, but because of truth. His voice could make people cry, dance, and believe, sometimes all within a single song. He was making more than $35,000 a week from concerts and publishing royalties, a fortune for any artist at that time. Yet, for all the fame and wealth, Otis remained deeply connected to his roots. At home in Macon, he built what he called the Big O Ranch, 300 acres of rolling land, complete with a lake, livestock, and space for his family to breathe. He called it his sanctuary. Friends would visit and find him riding horses, fishing, or talking about opening a summer camp for underprivileged kids. "Music made me," he'd say. but giving back keeps me human. His business sense was sharp, too. He founded Otis Redding Enterprises, invested in real estate and stocks, and even talked about building an airstrip on his property so he could visit home between tours. He wasn't just singing about success, he was living it with purpose. That same year, he traveled overseas for the first time. London, Paris, Stockholm, each city greeted him like royalty. The Beatles and Rolling Stones came to his shows, eager to learn from the man whose sound had inspired their own. Rod Stewart later said he cried the first time he saw Otis perform, because he'd never felt that kind of emotion on a stage before. In England, he received awards that once belonged only to Elvis Presley, the Melody Maker Poll's International Male Vocalist of the Year, breaking a 10-year streak. It was a moment of pride not just for him, but for every black artist who had fought for space in a world that often refused to see them. But even with global acclaim, Otis was restless. He wanted more than recognition, he wanted evolution. After years of dominating the soul charts, he dreamed of reaching the pop mainstream. In the summer of 1967, while staying on a rented houseboat in California, he began writing a song that felt different. Watching the ships glide through the bay, he jotted down the words, "Sittin' in the morning sun, I'll be sittin' when the evening comes." That song, "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay," would change everything. It was softer, reflective, almost haunting. The melody floated instead of shouted. His bandmates didn't know what to make of it. "It's not like the old Otis," one said. He just smiled. "It's where I'm going." By the fall, he recorded the track, though it wasn't finished. He wanted to add background vocals from the staple singers and one more verse when he returned from his December shows. The whistling at the end? That was just a placeholder. No one knew it would become one of the most recognizable sounds in music history. 1967 was supposed to be the year everything opened for him: movie offers from Hollywood, new record deals, duets with Carla Thomas and Aretha Franklin. For the first time, Otis Redding stood on the edge of worldwide stardom. But behind his bright smile and endless drive, there was fatigue. The constant touring, the pressure to top himself, the strain on his voice. He underwent throat surgery that November, worried he might never sing again. For 6 weeks, silence replaced the sound that had carried him this far. When his voice returned, he said it felt stronger but softer too. No one could have known that the next song he recorded would be his last. By late 1967, Otis Redding had become the soul of America's new sound. His music wasn't just heard, it was felt. From small southern clubs to international stages, his voice carried the warmth of truth and the fire of conviction. He was no longer the boy from Georgia trying to prove himself. He was the man who redefined what soul could be. His performances were nothing short of electric. At the Monterey Pop Festival that summer, he stood on stage before a sea of mostly white faces, an audience that had never truly seen a black soul artist command that kind of space. Under the California night sky, wearing a green suit that shimmered in the stage lights, Otis gave everything he had. When he sang "Try a Little Tenderness," the crowd erupted. He didn't just win them over, he united them. That night, a new chapter of American music began. For Otis, Monterey wasn't about fame. It was about belonging, about proving that soul music was universal. That moment placed him alongside artists like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, not as an opening act, but as an equal. Reporters later said he stole the festival. He didn't see it that way. He simply said, the music did what it was supposed to do. Back home, his career soared. The album King and Queen, a collaboration with Carla Thomas, became a hit, showing his softer, playful side. The chemistry between their voices brought joy to radio stations across the country. Their duet Tramp climbed the charts, blending humor and soul in a way that only Otis could pull off. He was everywhere: magazine covers, interviews, stage lights. The industry finally recognized him not just as a singer, but as a visionary. He wrote, produced, and managed his own projects through his label, Otis Records. He signed younger talents, giving them the same shot Stax once gave him. Despite all the noise of success, Otis kept his heart in Macon. He'd return to the Big O Ranch between tours, walking barefoot through the fields, watching his kids play near the lake. He often said that silence was the only thing that kept him balanced. "The stage gives me life," he told a friend once, "but home gives me peace." There was something deeply spiritual about the way he approached music. Before every performance, he'd bow his head and whisper a short prayer. He believed his voice was a gift meant to serve others, a way to remind people they weren't alone. By the fall of 1967, Otis had reached what many thought was the peak of a lifetime. The critics called him the new sound of America. Hollywood sent scripts, television producers asked him to host specials, and still, he remained the same man who told his band before every show, "Let's make them feel something tonight." But behind that success, small cracks began to show, not in his music, but in his body. The relentless touring had strained his voice to the edge. After surgery in November, he was ordered to rest. The stage lights went dark, and for the first time in years, he faced silence. He used that quiet to write, to reflect, to dream. Sitting by the water in California, he wrote about peace, stillness, and time, ideas that felt far from the chaos of the road. The song "Sittin" on the dock of the bay became his meditation, his way of slowing the world down. He didn't know it yet, but that stillness he was writing about would soon take on a meaning no one could have imagined. In the winter of 1967, Otis Redding's life seemed unstoppable. The crowds were larger, the stages brighter, and the music more powerful than ever. Yet somewhere behind that brilliance, there was fatigue, a quiet shadow that followed him from city to city. The surgery on his throat had left him shaken. For 6 weeks, he couldn't sing a note. To a man whose entire being was built on sound, the silence felt unbearable. He would hum to himself, just to make sure the voice was still there. When it finally returned, it came with a softer tone, more reflective, almost tender. It was as if his voice knew something his mind didn't. That time was running short. Otis began talking about slowing down. He wanted to spend more time at home, to see his kids grow, to finish the runway at his ranch so he could come and go without missing the simple things. But the world wanted more from him, more concerts, more appearances, more songs. His calendar was full through the next year. He didn't know how to say no. Those close to him noticed the change. He smiled less, talked quieter, carried himself like a man half in the present and half somewhere far away. Still, when the lights came on, he was fire again, commanding, joyful, unstoppable. It was as though performing was the only place he could still breathe freely. In early December, he planned a short trip through the Midwest with his band, the Bar-Kays, a group of young, energetic musicians who looked up to him like a brother. They played together with that raw, youthful energy that had always fueled Otis's own drive. The future felt wide open. On December 9, he performed in Cleveland, Ohio, on a television show called Upbeat. He sang "Try a Little Tenderness," one of his most powerful renditions. People who were there said his voice that night was otherworldly, as if he was reaching beyond himself. No one knew it would be his last televised performance. The next morning, the group prepared to fly to Madison, Wisconsin, for another show. The weather was terrible: cold rain, thick fog, warnings from the airport to stay grounded. But Otis had a rule: he never missed a concert. He told his pilot, Richard Fraser, "We've got fans waiting." When there had been problems with the plane before, an old Beechcraft H-18, small and aging. Friends, including James Brown, had warned him about it. Brown even said, "Man, you're gambling with your life flying that thing." But Otis believed in preparation, not superstition. The plane had carried them safely before. He trusted it would again. When the engines roared that afternoon, few words were spoken. Ben Cauley, the trumpet player, later recalled that everyone was relaxed, laughing, half asleep. Otis sat in the co-pilot seat, quiet, looking through the fog. He always loved being close to the flight controls, fascinated by the feeling of lift, the freedom above the clouds. Somewhere over Wisconsin, the sky began to shake. The wind hit hard. The plane dipped. No one screamed, just a sudden silence before the water. At 3:28 p.m., the aircraft disappeared into the fog over Lake Monona, 5 miles from the Madison airport. Only one man, Ben Cauley, survived. He said when he came to, the cold was unbearable, the water black and endless. He saw Otis's head above the waves for a moment, calm and still, before it vanished again. The news broke that evening. Soul singer Otis Redding dies in plane crash. The world stopped. Radios played his songs through the night, from Georgia to London. The man whose voice had carried so much life had fallen silent at 26. Some stars fade with time. Otis's didn't. It fell fast, brilliant, unforgettable. The cold air over Madison that December afternoon was unforgiving. Visibility was low, the clouds hanging so heavy that even the trees seemed to vanish into the mist. Somewhere above that gray horizon, a small twin-engine plane fought against the wind, carrying Otis Redding and 7 others from the Barkays. Inside the cabin, it was quiet. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady but strained. Ben Cawley, the trumpet player, had fallen asleep. Otis sat near the cockpit, staring into the fog. Calm but focused, he trusted his pilot and had flown through worse weather before. But that day, something was different. At 3:28 p.m., witnesses near Lake Monona saw the plane emerge from the clouds, shaking violently. There was no explosion, no fire, just a dull impact as it struck the icy water and began to sink. The surface rippled once, then went still. When Ben opened his eyes, he was underwater. The shock of freezing cold stole his breath. He kicked, desperate, until his hand found a seat cushion floating nearby. All around him was silence, the kind of silence that follows the end of a song. He would later say he saw Otis rise briefly to the surface, eyes open, but motionless. The others, guitarist Jimmy King, drummer Carl Cunningham, saxophonist Phelan Jones, and organist Ronnie Caldwell, never made it out. The pilot, Richard Fraser, and valet Matthew Kelly were also lost. Ben clung to that cushion for what felt like forever. The cold was so severe that his body began to shut down. Rescue teams reached him minutes before hypothermia could finish what the crash had started. He was the only survivor. When divers returned the next morning, they found the wreckage just 5 miles from the airport. Otis was still strapped in his seat. The scene was quiet, no flames, no chaos, just the gray reflection of sky on water. The news spread fast. Radio stations stopped their regular programs. DJs spoke in disbelief, some too emotional to continue. In Georgia, the church bells in Macon rang through the night. Across the Atlantic, the Beatles and Rolling Stones released statements mourning the man they called a genius of feeling. In a single moment, one of the brightest voices of a generation was gone. The official report said the cause of the crash was never fully determined. The weather was severe, the battery had issues, but no one could say for certain what went wrong. To those who loved him, it didn't matter. The loss was already too big to measure. That night, as the news echoed through radios and living rooms across America, fans played "Try a Little Tenderness" and wept. The song sounded different now, heavier, prophetic, like he had known something the rest of the world didn't. And maybe he did. In the days that followed the crash, the world felt quieter. Radio hosts tried to find the right words, but most couldn't. They simply played his songs one after another, letting his voice do the talking. Fans called into stations across America, some crying, some silent. It was as if the entire country had lost a friend. In Macon, Georgia, crowds gathered outside the Redding home, holding candles against the cold. His wife, Zelma, answered letters from strangers who wrote to say that Otis's music had saved them during their darkest days. There was grief, but there was also pride that one of their own had changed music forever. The funeral drew thousands. Musicians from every corner of the industry came to pay respect, from soul and gospel to rock and blues. James Brown sent flowers and a note that read simply, "He was the best of us." The service ended with a choir singing Amen, the same hymn Otis had once sung as a boy. Yet even in mourning, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed the crash was no accident, whispers about insurance, old debts, the dangers of the industry. But those who knew him refused to let speculation define his memory. To them, Otis's story was never about tragedy. It was about love, discipline, and hope. A few weeks later, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released. The unfinished song with that haunting whistle at the end became his greatest hit. It reached #1 on the Billboard charts, making Otis Redding the first artist in history to earn a posthumous #1 record. Millions heard that whistle and felt as if he was still there, watching the tide roll away. The record's success only deepened the ache. People couldn't stop wondering what else he might have created if he'd lived, what new directions soul music could have taken with him still leading the way. Critics called the song a new voice in American music, proof that he had been evolving beyond soul into something timeless. Back at Stax Records, the staff struggled to go back to work. They kept his chair empty in the studio for months. Booker T, Jones later said, "It felt like the lights went out, and we didn't know how to turn them back on." For the members of the Bar-Kays, the loss was too heavy to speak about. Ben Cawley, the lone survivor, often said he could still hear Otis's laughter in his dreams. When he returned to the stage years later, he carried a trumpet engraved with Otis's initials, not as a symbol of sorrow, but as a promise to keep the music alive. In time, the noise of rumors faded, but the songs never did. The silence that followed the crash became something sacred, a space where his music could live forever. In the months after Otis Redding's passing, his absence was everywhere. Yet somehow, his presence felt stronger than ever. His voice filled radios, record stores, and jukeboxes across America, not as an echo of what was lost, but as proof that something eternal had been left behind. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay rose to #1, and stayed there, a haunting melody that seemed to capture the ache of time itself. That gentle whistle at the end, once meant as a placeholder, became a kind of farewell, the sound of peace after a life lived in motion. The song went on to win 2 Grammy Awards in 1968, Best R&B Vocal Performance and Best Rhythm and Blues Song. It was history's way of saying what words couldn't, that Otis Redding had given the world something too honest to fade. In the years that followed, his influence deepened. Artists across genres from Rod Stewart to Aretha Franklin, from Bruce Springsteen to Jay-Z carried traces of his sound. They borrowed his phrasing, his vulnerability, the way he could turn a single word into a confession. Even generations later, musicians studying soul music still start with Otis. What made his art timeless wasn't just the voice, it was the spirit behind it. He sang like a man trying to bridge 2 worlds, joy and sorrow, fame and faith, life and loss. In his short career, he recorded more than 200 songs, but it was the sincerity that made them unforgettable. He didn't perform for applause, he performed for connection. By the 1970s, his music had become the backbone of modern soul and R&B. New voices like Al Green and Marvin Gaye carried forward the emotional truth he had set in motion. And as the decades turned, hip-hop producers began sampling his songs not as nostalgia, but as a form of reverence. His work spoke across generations, languages, and styles. In Georgia, his hometown of Macon became a place of pilgrimage. The Redding family founded the Otis Redding Foundation, dedicated to music education for children. Each year, young artists gather to learn, play, and carry forward his dream, the dream of turning pain into purpose, melody into meaning. At Stax Records, the sound he helped shape became a movement. The label's signature blend of rhythm, gospel, and grit still inspires new artists who chase authenticity over perfection. To this day, when musicians talk about capturing feel in a song, they often end up talking about Otis. Perhaps the greatest measure of his legacy is the way his music continues to feel alive, not as a relic of the past, but as a voice that still speaks to the present. His songs are used in films, documentaries, and memorials. His name is whispered whenever people talk about truth in art. He may have been gone since 1967, but the emotion he left behind never aged. Each time Dock of the Bay plays, it feels less like a recording and more like a reminder that the most powerful art doesn't end with the artist. Otis Redding never lived to see how far his voice would travel. But maybe, somewhere beyond the horizon he once sang about, he already knew. In the decades since his passing, the name Otis Redding has become more than music, it's a memory shared by generations. Across the ocean, in the same London theaters where he once stood, his records still echo through dimly lit bars and late-night radio shows. In America, his songs have become woven into the country's emotional fabric, the soundtrack of both triumph and heartbreak. Critics and historians often describe him as the bridge between eras, the artist who carried gospel's conviction into rhythm and blues, and who gave soul its heartbeat. But those who knew his work before the world did say something simpler. He sang like he meant it. That honesty is what still sets him apart. In Europe, his 1967 tour remains legendary. Fans who saw him perform in London, Paris, and Stockholm never forgot the way he held a stage, not with spectacle, but with sincerity. When Dock of the Bay climbed the charts overseas after his death, it wasn't just a hit, it was a eulogy. Even people who didn't know English understood the emotion. The whistle, the quiet, the longing, it spoke a universal language. In America, his influence found a second life during the civil rights movement and beyond. His music became a form of unity, proof that art could transcend color, background, or faith. In a time when the country felt divided, Otis Redding's voice reminded people of what they shared: emotion, humanity, and the simple need to be heard. When younger artists talk about him now, they don't just mention the hits. They mention the feeling. They describe the way his records sound alive, as if he's still somewhere in the room. Contemporary musicians from Alicia Keys to Anderson, Pac have spoken of studying his phrasing, his restraint, the raw conviction that turned every song into a story. Even filmmakers and storytellers draw from his legacy. His songs appear in scenes of love, loss, and reflection in films that try to capture the soul of an era. Whenever Try a Little Tenderness or Dock of the Bay plays on screen, the world pauses. The music has become shorthand for humanity itself. Back in Macon, the Otis Redding Foundation continues his mission. His family runs programs for youth, teaching them not only how to make music, but how to live with purpose. Every summer, new voices fill the same air he once breathed, turning his dream into a living tradition. The Big O Ranch, his old home, still stands as a quiet reminder that greatness often begins with humility. It's rare for an artist to remain timeless, rarer still to remain necessary. But Otis's songs are as relevant now as they were in 1967. They remind us that the measure of a life isn't in its length, but in its depth in the echoes it leaves behind. He may have died young, but his voice aged beautifully in the world's memory. And every time the tide rolls away, his spirit rolls with it, still watching, still waiting, still singing. The morning light over Lake Monona is quiet now. The fog drifts just as it did that December day, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear a melody carried by the wind. It's faint, just a whistle, almost fading, yet it feels familiar, like a memory returning home. Otis Redding's story was never just about how he died. It was about how fully he lived. Every note he sang came from a place of truth, unpolished, sincere, and filled with the kind of hope that only exists when you've known struggle. He gave people permission to feel deeply, to embrace both joy and sorrow in the same breath. He was 26 when the world lost him, but his spirit grew older through every person his music touched. His songs didn't fade with the years. They matured. They became hymns for ordinary people, reminders that emotion can outlast time. For those who remember, it's hard to separate the man from the message. He stood for something rare: dignity without pride, humility without fear. Even at his height, he never forgot the church choirs of Macon, the long nights on the road, the faces in the crowd who believed in him before the fame. He understood that greatness wasn't about being remembered by millions. It was about moving one heart at a time. The legacy of Otis Redding lives not in marble statues or Hollywood stars, but in the quiet spaces his songs still fill: a diner at midnight, a car radio on a long drive, a voice humming along somewhere far away. The sound remains honest, unchanging. When people hear Dock of the Bay today, they often say it feels peaceful, like a soul at rest. Maybe that's the gift he left behind, the understanding that peace isn't the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. His music taught the world that even endings can sing. So when the tide rolls in and the sky turns gray, remember the man who once turned sorrow into sound. He didn't chase immortality. He simply sang his truth, and somehow, that truth never stopped echoing. Some stars burn fast, and some fade quietly. But a few, the rare few, never fade at all. They shine where fewer eyes can see, lighting the places the world forgot. Otis Redding was one of those stars.